They expected barbed wire and orders, not Beethoven behind the fences. An RAF sergeant at Stalag Luft III, in the middle years of the war, heard the rumor first. It came the way most things did in a camp built to control the flow of time. Quietly, in fragments, a sentence broken across bunks and mess tins, carried by men who had learned to speak in half-claims so as not to break a fragile hope. Someone had seen a notice, not official enough to wear a stamp, but bold enough to name a composer's music that had once filled cathedrals and small parlors at home. The promise was simple and difficult at once. An evening concert organized by the German side with Beethoven on the program. The sergeant did not say the name aloud right away. He rolled it in his teeth like a seed, as if taste could confirm truth where documents could not. Coal smoke moved under the rafters, heavy and familiar, and a stove door ticked as it cooled, the small music of a camp that survived on routine. Men looked up from their bowls. No one laughed. The rumor did not sound like a prank because it carried the plain weight of administration, permissions, times, a place to stand, and the knowledge that nothing in a camp happened without a key turning somewhere. The day held its shape as if nothing were coming. There was work as permitted, the lines at roll call, the counting and a recounting, the visible arithmetic that turned men into numbers and back again. Guards walked their loops and changed their posts. Boots scuffed grit from the packed earth. A gate hinge gave its tired groan and became quiet. In the barrack, there was talk about music that kept circling to the same pivot. What did it mean if the enemy could play Beethoven here, where wire stitched the sky, and every absence had a name? The sergeant remembered an English afternoon before the war, and the way a piano could make a room smell faintly of old polish and lemon oil. That memory felt dangerous, like looking too long through a window. He shook it off with a small, practical movement, tugging at the seam of his sleeve where wool had thinned to a shine. Outside, the light deserted the yard early, as it often did, and the camp pressed deeper into the sound of its own breathing, the murmur that set in when men waited for an event that might prove them wrong about the world. Near evening, the machines of permission began to move. A corporal with a list came to the door and called names. The sergeant's was one of them. There were rules for such movements. No one needed to have them recited because the rules lived in the body now. Walk in twos. Keep to the path. No speaking to the fence. No wandering toward the dark. The column formed, shabby and precise, and stepped out, watched by guards whose faces had learned not to show interest. The lock gave a metal clack that belonged to every door in that place, and the men crossed a short square where frost or dust, depending on the month, took the same pale color under lamp glow. The air had the particular bite of a night that forced you to notice your breath. It came white, then vanished, and left a taste of iron, as if the cold itself had a flavor. Somewhere, a dog barked once, and then thought better of it. The sergeant counted his steps, and tried not to count the memories that walked alongside him. They came to a long hut used for assemblies when the camp wanted to show itself orderly. The guards at the entrance sent their eyes down the line and let the numbers pass. Inside, the world narrowed in a way that did not feel like a threat for once. It felt like the old, serious narrowing of a room before music. A stage at one end, benches, a low stretch of wood that would bear the weight of men sitting to be still. Kerosene lamps threw their steady stain against the walls, yellow and stubborn, and turned the dust in the air into slow-moving weather. The sergeant sat where he was told and watched the front. There were German uniforms near the platform, and the hunched shapes of instruments in transit from silence to use. One of the musicians lifted a violin case and drew out something that shone in strips where light found it. Another set a chair and leaned forward to adjust the spine of a stand with a patience that belonged to a different life. The room's odor shifted to include something resinous and sweet as someone thumbed a small cake of rosin and passed it across hair. Men in the benches closed their hands around knee and cap and tried to figure out if posture could explain belief. A guard coughed. It sounded like a man whose throat had given up on warmth. The sergeant noticed the way the lamps stopped short of the stage edge and how that strip of half-dark made a bridge between prisoners and musicians that was not exactly political or sentimental. It was practical, like an armistice drafted to hold for an hour. He thought about propaganda and what it had asked him to store in his head. Not simply that the enemy could be cruel, he had learned that firsthand, but that the enemy could not also be careful with beauty. The camp had already disturbed his certainty in other small ways. A packet of cigarettes given without comment after a bad inspection. A guard who once adjusted a bandage with awkward fingers and the quick impatience of a man who could not stand to see something done badly. None of that had changed the logic of wire and watchtowers. This felt different without announcing itself as such. It felt like entering a room of exacting work and seeing that the tools had been oiled and stored. A man with a baton walked to the front. He did not make a speech. He raised his hand in the older language of attention, and the room obeyed before it decided to. Somewhere very near the center of the space, a single note sounded, an A, steady and indifferent as a level held to a wall. It entered the air and marked it, and the players turned to meet it, one by one, each instrument folding its small private argument into the shared agreement. The sound lifted the fine hairs along the sergeant's forearms, where the skin had gone tight from the cold. It moved in a straight line to a place behind his sternum, where surprises sometimes went to be counted. He realized he had not tasted the thin soup from the evening. His mouth was clean and dry, as if waiting. The A ended without a flourish. The bows lowered. The room held itself as if the farther parts of it were leaning in to hear what would happen next. Outside, the camp kept up its assigned noises, the measured footfalls along the fence, the murmur of men in huts who had not been called to this, but inside, the air had been cleared the way glass is cleaned, by effort that advertises nothing. They were here by permission. The sergeant knew it and did not resent the fact. Permission was the only currency the place minted, and tonight it had purchased a seat and a claim worth testing. He felt an ache that belonged more to winter mornings than to nights like this, an ache that came when cold air made lungs sting a little and the eyes water for reasons that were not yet feelings. The men around him were quiet in a way that had nothing to do with obedience and everything to do with measurement. A page shifted at the front, a tiny, dry sound like hands rubbed for warmth. Then a bow touched a string with the lightness of someone practicing not to hurry. The sergeant tilted his head as if listening to a language he knew until the war had made him doubt it. Whatever came next would either break the rumor and send it back to its narrow bed, or it would stand upright and show its height. He drew a slow breath that tasted faintly of lamp smoke and wool, and waited for the music to tell him what, exactly, the enemy had chosen to play, and who among them would carry it into the room. The question of permission had already been answered by the fact of their presence, but the details of that permission circled quietly within the room. Would applause be allowed at the end of a movement or only at the end of the evening? Would a man be permitted the brief insolence of a cough during a slow passage, or would such a sound trigger the reflex of discipline? No one wanted to be the instrument of a rule. The guards had their own version of the same calculation, measuring posture against the human tendency to soften automatically when a set of notes settles on the air. The sergeant did not expect a speech to clarify any of it. This was not a civic hall or a town fete. This was a place where the key turned and the hinges argued, and men learned to guess what the absence of command allowed. If the program's language was careful, it did not feel like a dodge. It felt like an invitation to recognize a piece not by the authority of its naming, but by the weight of recognition as it entered the ear. The sergeant thought of the way a familiar melody can make the skin pull tight along the bridge of the nose, preparing the eyes in self-defense against the idea of tears. He forced himself to imagine nothing precise, not an adagio set like a lantern in a long corridor, not a slow movement that had traveled through chapels and schools and living rooms toward this unlikely room where men sat in a geometry meant for counting. He imagined only that someone would lift a baton and someone else would understand that gesture, and that between them there would be a line strong enough to hold for the length of a page. On the platform, the conductor, if that was the right word for a man leading musicians in a prison camp, glanced once toward the side where an officer sat with folded arms, as if to say, by look alone, that the hour would continue as agreed. He received no response beyond stillness, which sufficed. He tapped the stand lightly with the thin stick in his hand and nodded to the first desks. The lamps seemed to lean in, though they did not move. In the benches, backs straightened not by command, but by the universal etiquette of listening. Somewhere, a door settled on its hinge with a tiny click that could have been mistaken for the beginning of a snare if anyone had been careless enough to bring a drum into this arrangement. No one had. Breath gathered discreetly along the front row, the shared intake musicians take when they are about to put their hands to a public test. The sergeant felt the blood in his fingertips, warm now where it had been stiff, and recognized the small vanity of wanting to remember this exactly, down to the way the paper's fold line divided a vowel. He pressed a palm against the program and lifted his eyes. The room was as quiet as it could be, without contradicting its true nature. Outside, boots crossed gravel on a schedule. Inside, men prepared to enter a different schedule, laid down long before any of them were born. He had promised himself not to read the future into the present, not to imagine that one performance could rearrange convictions formed by years of war and days of captivity. He settled instead for the modest expectation that sound, once begun, would refuse to be anything but itself. At the front, a bow rose, a breath was held, and the first notes stepped into the air. The question of permission had already been answered by the fact of their presence, but the details of that permission circled quietly within the room. Would applause be allowed at the end of a movement or only at the end of the evening? Would a man be permitted the brief insolence of a cough during a slow passage, or would such a sound trigger the reflex of discipline? No one wanted to be the instrument of a rule. The guards had their own version of the same calculation, measuring posture against the human tendency to soften automatically when a set of notes settles on the air. The sergeant did not expect a speech to clarify any of it. This was not a civic hall or a town fete. This was a place where the key turned and the hinges argued, and men learned to guess what the absence of command allowed. If the program's language was careful, it did not feel like a dodge. It felt like an invitation to recognize a piece not by the authority of its naming, but by the weight of recognition as it entered the ear. The sergeant thought of the way a familiar melody can make the skin pull tight along the bridge of the nose,
preparing the eyes in self-defense against the idea of tears. He forced himself to imagine nothing precise, not an adagio set like a lantern in a long corridor, not a slow movement that had traveled through chapels and schools and living rooms toward this unlikely room where men sat in a geometry meant for counting. He imagined only that someone would lift a baton and someone else would understand that gesture, and that between them there would be a line strong enough to hold for the length of a page.
A bow touched the string, and the room leaned in. What followed did not arrive as proclamation, but as a line drawn with the steadiness of a hand that had learned patience before it learned power. The first notes felt their way across the benches and found the places where breath had been held too long. Low voices in the strings laid down a floor that seemed to extend the planks beneath the prisoner's boots, and on that new surface a melody began to walk, unhurried, sure of its footing, uninterested in display. The sergeant heard it first as contour rather than fact, a rise he recognized from a world that had not asked anything of him but attention, and a fall that seemed to leave warmth in the air the way a hand leaves warmth in a sleeve. A single woodwind entered with a tone so clear it sounded rinsed. The tiny click of its pad sealing between phrases read like punctuation, reminding the ear that order can exist without cruelty. Around him, men went still in ways that had nothing to do with fear. The lamps gave their soft hiss, steady as breathing, and the resin-dark sweetness of rosin mixed with the faint bite of cold iron from a nail-head near the sergeant's knee. Somewhere to the side, an officer adjusted the angle of his cap by a degree no one could see. The musicians did not look up. The line broadened and took on weight without thickening, as if the room itself had widened to let the harmony stand at full height. Bows worked with a discipline that did not ask to be admired. The conductor's hand traced arcs that made time visible for anyone who needed proof that it was being kept. In the middle benches, a man swallowed hard enough to be heard 2 places over. The sound was neither apology nor challenge, only the throat's reflex when the chest draws in too much air too quickly. The sergeant felt the wool of his sleeve scratch the tender skin at his wrist and left it there, unwilling to disturb the small economy of sensations by reaching to smooth it. Outside, gravel took a footstep, and then another, on a schedule the camp could have recited in its sleep. Inside, the melody refused to hurry or to repeat itself merely to please. It advanced as if carrying something worth keeping whole. If anyone had expected triumph, they were given something stricter. The music did not argue that beauty could abolish the fact of wire. It showed what discipline could rescue from a hard place and hold up without shame. A cellist rolled a quiet figure that set the floorboards murmuring in sympathy. The sergeant felt that tiny vibration through the soles of his boots, a private message delivered by wood to bone. A page turned near the front with the dry whisper of paper that has been handled cleanly. A second later, the same page turned 2 desks down, proof that even this was governed by agreement. On the far right, the guard shifted and the leather of his belt creaked with a fatigue that belonged to late hours rather than to conflict. The prisoners held their bodies within a narrow grammar learned from inspections and head counts, but their faces forgot to perform neutrality. Eyes softened, jaws unclenched. One man's mouth opened a fraction as if to equalize pressure, the way ears do when altitude changes. Except the change here was inward and had nothing to do with height. The theme returned not as repetition, but as recognition, lightly altered by a harmony that carried its own quiet authority. The sergeant's memory offered him a room from before the war, a municipal hall that smelled of polish and chalk dust and damp wool, and then withdrew it, leaving only the sensation of having been held gently by sound. He welcomed the restraint. He was suspicious of memory's talent for adding lights that had never been there. He chose to inventory the present instead. The neat bow hair, some strands sprung a little from the hours, the faint white line along a violinist's jaw where the chin rest pressed, the conductor's left hand shaping release with a tenderness not often on display among men in uniform. The air tasted faintly of kerosene and old wood, and under that, something like metal cooled too quickly and left to remember heat by itself.
At a measured crest, the harmony opened and allowed the woodwinds to speak in a voice that did not ask permission to be beautiful. The prisoners did not move, but the mood of the benches shifted toward a kind of collective listening that felt almost civic, as if the room had sewn itself, for a few minutes, into a country defined not by borders but by consent to a tempo. The sergeant noticed his heartbeat settle into an order that matched nothing he could name, and did not resist it. A violin sang a narrow, aching interval that touched the bridge of his nose with the threat of sting. He forced his breath to arrive evenly, and it did, cool at first, then warmer as it turned and left. A guard near the aisle softened his shoulders by a fraction that could have been discountable were it not mirrored, seconds later, by a second guard at the opposite flank. If anyone had chosen to call that coincidence, they would not have been wrong, but they would have missed the way sound can organize posture without consulting rank. The middle portion of the movement, if movement was the right word, since no one had been told exactly what they were hearing, brought a steadier pulse that made time feel like a long road under even wheels. The cellos laid down a surface sturdy enough for grief to walk on without stumbling, and above them violins traced a ribbon whose edges were clean and whose center held a warmth the lamps could only imitate. The sergeant let his eyes drop to the program on his knee and then lifted them again, preferring the authority of the ear to the suggestion of print. He became suddenly aware of the rough seam inside his collar and the way it rasped the skin at the base of his neck. The discomfort registered, and then was carried off by 3 bars of harmony so balanced they made the room feel squared and level, as if someone had put a spirit level to the air. A small cough escaped from the benches, the bodily kind that presents itself without petition. No one turned. The conductor's hand lowered and raised again, as if forgiving the interruption before it reached the player's attention. The line continued without scar. At the rear, a door settled deeper into its frame and gave a clicking sound quiet enough to be mistaken for part of the texture. The men nearest the stage shifted their weight to relieve a pressure point, then went still again, as if anxious to assure the sound that they knew how to return what it asked for. The sergeant thought of the boundary between permission and complicity, and found that the music did not cross it. It simply demanded accuracy and gave back poise. He accepted that bargain because it made sense. He had long ago run out of patience for gestures that promised what they could not deliver. As the section drew toward its close, the melody returned with a gravity that made the lamps seem a little smaller, not in shame, but in scale, as if the room had admitted a horizon wider than any of its walls. The prisoners' faces showed the effort of keeping expression within customary lines. Concentration deepened into something that, in other circumstances, would have looked like tenderness. The sergeant noticed the saline taste at the back of his mouth that sometimes arrives before the eyes water, and pretended it was memory of a winter wind. He held his posture as if correctness could postpone the moment when feeling demanded proof. The cadence gathered itself, postponed resolution once, then twice, and then allowed it, not as a door flung open, but as a lock turning without noise. When the harmony settled, the silence that followed was not empty. It was shaped, as if the sound still drew breath somewhere just past hearing. In that held quiet, a few men realized they had been gripping their caps too tightly and loosened their hands. The music had more to say, but already something unguarded had begun to move along the benches, and the next passage would find it waiting.
The silence after that cadence held just long enough for men to notice their own faces. A second line entered, quieter and closer to the ground, and something in its patient shape slipped past the discipline of posture and went to work where rules could not reach. It was not a grand overturning, not a spectacle that would have embarrassed the room. It was the more ordinary collapse of defenses that have been held too long against an enemy that is not strictly human, but consists of absence, delay, and the stubborn refusal of news. Along the benches, a few shoulders lifted with the small, involuntary breath people take when they are about to admit they feel something. Then they stilled again, as if ashamed to add motion to a sound that asked only for stillness. The sergeant felt the first sting at the corners of his eyes and did not blink immediately, unwilling to turn a sensation into a fact. When he finally did, the tears did not fall. They settled like a film that made the lamps blur at their edges. The air kept its layered smell of kerosene and seasoned wood, with a thread of cold that made every breath taste faintly metallic, as though the night had been poured through wire before reaching their mouths. Bows moved with the modest assurance of work that has nothing to prove. A single bass line gave the room a spine and taught the men how to sit without effort. The melody did what melodies sometimes do when they have survived too many rooms. It found private doors and opened them without asking. For one man, it was the sound of a pre-war Sunday in a town hall whose varnish always released to lemon sweetness when warmed by bodies and time. For another, it was the echo from a chapel where black coats and black ties tried to contain grief and failed with decency. For another, it was a girl at a piano, one hand faltering and the other finding the line anyway. No one needed to say any of this aloud. The room's etiquette forbade words and rewarded control, but memory has its own manners. A prisoner near the aisle raised his hand not to his face, but to his collar, worrying the seams so the fingers would have honesty to do while the eyes learned how to behave. Another leaned forward a fraction, as if listening from a better angle could confine feeling to the ear and keep it from stepping lower into the chest. The sergeant tasted salt and refused to call it by its common name. He breathed in through his nose until the back of his throat cooled and steadied. To either side, the men were busy with similar negotiations, each one inventing a small task that would disguise the fact that a line of music had found them undefended. The guards on the flanks did not interfere. Perhaps they understood that the discipline they preferred could be maintained inside this quieter surrender. Perhaps they simply recognized the calculation that an unbroken hour would do more to prove order than a tightened leash. One shifted his weight and let the leather creak once, then kept still, as if aware that the sound might be misread as disapproval. Another glanced along the benches with an expression that was not sympathy, but was not far from it, the look of a man who has seen a knot come loose and knows better not to tug the rope. On the platform, the musicians observed the room with the caution of craftsmen who check their work without leaving fingerprints on it. A clarinet's key clicked between phrases, the tiny, dry sound neat as the closing of a box. A violist changed position, and the chair leg made a soft scrape that the wood absorbed without complaint. Everywhere, small noises reported their existence,
and were accepted, then forgotten, absorbed into a larger agreement. It did not take much to make tears show themselves. A sudden close harmony leaned against the melody like a friend arriving late and apologizing with warmth. A cello voice climbed one careful step and another, and the effort of that climb spoke plainly of home without naming it. The sergeant's vision softened just enough that the conductor's baton lost its sharpness and became an intention rather than a stick. He reached down as if to steady the program on his knee and found his hand unnecessary there. The paper did not need him. The wool at his wrist felt rougher now that the skin beneath it had warmed, and when a tear finally broke loose, it found the edge of the sleeve and left a narrow track that cooled quickly in the air. He kept his chin level. No one around him tried to hide anything with quick gestures. No handkerchiefs appeared. There were not many to spare. The room's dignity consisted in letting the face be the face, without adding choreography. When a second tear followed, he did not negotiate with it. He understood suddenly that the argument he had prepared for why he should not be moved by sound produced by men in the enemy's uniform belonged to a different hour and could not be heard over this one.
Whispers did not bloom. Even the instinct to share a look was restrained, because this kind of feeling hates to be witnessed and is most itself when it can be believed to be private. At the far end of the row, a prisoner's chest hitched twice and then settled into a slower rhythm. His hand remained open on his knee, palm up, as if he had forgotten to make a fist of habit. The lamps hissed softly, a steady breath that perforated the silence just enough to keep it alive. Dust motes navigated the air like patient insects, and the light gave each a brief citizenship before letting it drop back into invisibility. A patch of floorboard beneath the sergeant's boot vibrated minutely where a low note drew the room together, and the sensation moved up through leather and sock like a message that had traveled a long way and finally knew where to go. The cold in the room withdrew from the center and took its place at the edges, in corners and under benches, and left the middle to the work at hand. If the musicians noticed the change along the benches, they behaved as though the correct response to being trusted was precision. A phrase that might have invited flourish arrived spare and exact, like a letter written in a firm hand and without ornament. The conductor's left hand released a cadence with the gentleness one saves for fragile materials, and a brief rest opened in the score like a door into cool air. The room took that air quietly and did not squander it. The sergeant thought about the arithmetic of propaganda, the way it had tried to prove that cruelty was a whole number with no remainder. He was not inclined to balance it now with the claim that beauty exonerates. The mathematics were not that simple. What he felt instead was the older reality that human hands can be taught to do one thing beautifully while still belonging to a time that asks them to do another thing terribly. The recognition did not absolve anyone. It merely made the world larger than the story had allowed, and the cost of that enlargement ran warm along his cheek. The music reached a passage so still that everyone could hear the room deciding not to move. In that stillness, a single cough arrived from outside, a far corner where a guard on another post cleared his throat against the cold. The sound came filtered through distance and wood and found no echo. The prisoners let the quiet settle again and discovered that nothing fragile had broken.
Near the front, a violinist smoothed a stray hair back into the bow with a thumb. The gesture looked like an apology for disorder and landed like reassurance. The sergeant's eyes stung once more and then steadied. He felt the familiar ache at the hinge of the jaw that comes when a man is holding himself together, and he allowed it, because holding together seemed, for the moment, a way of honoring what was being done correctly within sight of the wire. When the phrase resolved, it did so with the kind of rightness that does not cheer. It closes. A brief, shaped quiet followed, and in it men decided, each for himself, whether the wet on the face would be permitted to remain. The hour was not over. The room's attention gathered itself again, ready for whatever the next section would give, and somewhere in that readiness lay the question of how this would end and what, if anything, they would be allowed to show when the last note fell. Applause felt risky, so the room waited to see how silence would be read. The musicians held their instruments lowered at a neutral angle while the last overtone died against wood and lamp glass. Then a few hands met cautiously, not loud enough to challenge authority, just enough to show that the hour had landed where it meant to land. The sound of those first claps was soft and granular, like rain beginning on a tar roof, and it paused in mid-breath when a guard's head turned. After a heartbeat, the rhythm resumed, contained and decorous, and even the officer near the side did not intervene. The sergeant brought his palms together with the restraint of a man measuring risk. The sting across the skin felt clean, as if the act were a kind of washing. The conductor bowed once, efficient and unadorned. The players acknowledged the room with a fraction of movement, and a thin curtain of ordinary sound descended. Chair legs scraping a little, a key clicking shut on a clarinet case, a violin string released with the faintest twang as tension eased. A lamp hissed as a wick was lowered. The air smelled of warm rosin and cooled metal, with the thread of kerosene keeping its grip through everything. When dismissal came, it arrived as a gesture rather than a word, and the benches emptied in orderly lines that looked, in the half-light, like a diagram of obedience successfully tested. Outside, night had put a crust on the ground. Boots ground the grit into a whisper that rose and fell with the pace of the column. The men did not speak at first, because speech felt like a violation of a boundary they had only just learned to respect. The camp's usual sounds reasserted themselves, the chain at a gate giving its two-note complaint, a distant dog reconsidering the utility of a bark, the small thunder of a pail set down too firmly in a kitchen hut, and each noise seemed both braver and more trivial after the shaped quiet they had shared. Breath steamed from faces that still carried the damp trace of what had happened inside, and the cold turned that damp to cool streaks that tugged at the skin as they dried. The sergeant walked with his hands inside his sleeves, fingers finding the polished edge at the cuff that years of friction had made smooth. He pressed it like a worry stone, more to keep his focus exact than to comfort himself. A guard at the flank paced them with a stride that suggested no urgency. The wire hummed its usual non-music under a light wind. Somewhere near the far fence, gravel shifted under a posted man's boot to the slow, dry rhythm of boredom doing its duty. In the barrack, the room took them back in the same way a house takes back men who have come in late, with the refusal to look surprised. The stove ticked as its iron remembered heat. Smoke had left a brownish reminder on the ceiling that the eye did not see until it looked for it. Straw filled the air with its faintly sweet dust when blankets were shaken and laid. Tin cups made their thin notes as men looked for the last of something that passed for coffee. The brew had the flat, scorched taste of almost grain and almost bean, but it was hot, and heat mattered more than flavor. The sergeant sat on his bunk board and let his shoulders fall against the upmost slat. The wood pressed a narrow line between bones. Conversation began the way men in captivity prefer it to begin, at the edges and with caution, as if the room needed to be taught anew how to hold words without spilling them. No one tried to interpret the evening on behalf of everyone else. Instead, they offered small statements that could be owned without argument. That the second section's entrance was clean as a cut. That the conductor's left hand had the habit of shaping release, as if handling thin glass. That a guard's shoulders had dropped without meaning to during a quiet passage. They did not call what had happened by any of the names a freer world would have used. They let the details stand and let the larger question remain useful and unsentenced. Paper appeared, as it always did, when a day insisted on being pinned down. A prisoner reached under his mattress and brought out a notebook the color of faded slate. Its corners had been made round by weeks of travel between board and blanket. A pencil nub came next, wrapped in thread, to give it something like a grip. It smelled faintly of cedar where the wood had been pared, and of graphite in the way that touches the back of the nose rather than the tongue. He bent over his knee and tried to conjure sentences that did not argue. He wrote about the lamps and about the click of keys and about the way the room had chosen to sit still, as if stillness were a right that could be claimed. He did not write the word tears. He was not sure the page had earned it. Beside him, the sergeant scratched a line across a folded scrap torn from a parcel paper margin, committing to paper only what he could defend to himself later. That for the length of a movement, men had experienced exactitude without threat, and that this had done something to their faces. The sound of writing was small and dry, the voice of paper when it is asked to accept being proof. Not everyone wrote. Some lay on their backs and watched a sliver of frost creep along a nailhead near the window. Some picked at a seam or at a thread beginning to lift from a cuff, the way a man will undo a knot he cannot see. One refolded the program carefully along its factory creases and slid inside his tunic as if it were an identity that might need producing later. One lifted his cup and took in a careful mouthful of hot liquid and let it sit on the tongue before swallowing, as if he were learning again how to calibrate temperature after an hour of listening had reset the senses. A pair of men rehearsed a non-conversation. One asked if the stove would hold until morning. The other said it would not, but that they would hold instead. And the exchange performed its duty of taking up space without displacing anything that mattered. Above them, along the upper bunks, a man coughed and then apologized into wool, and the apology sounded like the old world, where small courtesies did not need to argue for their place. Authority had its own work to do, and it did it with the same steady refusal to dramatize. A guard stepped in, counted without counting aloud, let his eyes travel the length of the room, and withdrew. If he noticed faces swollen at the lids or noses rubbed red with rough knuckles, he did not register it to the room. The doors shut with the dry finality peculiar to doors in winter. Its latch spoke a syllable that meant the hour for private speech was closing. In the dimness that followed, embossed by lamp smoke and the flat mineral scent of cooling iron, the barrack exhaled. Men turned, the straws sang its quiet friction, and blankets found shoulders with their familiar rasp. The sergeant felt the grit at the edge of his pillow tick his cheek and did not brush it away. He let his eyes close against a darkness that still held the after-image of a baton's arc, and behind that, the cooler shape of a room that had learned to be silent with intention rather than with fear. Sleep came no faster for having been moved. It came, as it always did, in a place where clocks are irrelevant, in pieces, negotiated minute by minute with the cold, with the noises of men who had not yet found their own pieces, with the knowledge that morning had already been scheduled by a hand none of them would see. When morning arrived, it announced itself with the smells that pass for a reveille in camps: damp wool warming under bodies, a stove coaxed awake with stingy fuel, and the sharply clean note of soap that took the grease from skin and left it tight. The light at the window had the gray of hammered tin, a mess tin knocked once against a table. The sergeant woke with the sense that a small weight had settled somewhere behind his ribs and did not intend to move on quickly. He sat, laced his boots with the ordinary efficiency captivity demands, and watched a man 2 bunks down remove a folded scrap from his tunic and add 2 dry lines to it before replacing it, as if tucking in a child. The day would ask for its usual chores. The camp would return to its arithmetic. Yet the talk at first light contained a new kind of caution, the kind people use when they are protecting a thing not yet strong enough to survive the roughness of being named. Someone asked whether such concerts had happened before. Someone else said they had heard of a program once, not here, but under similar rules, and the claim hung in the air like a promise looking for proof. The sergeant kept his answers small and accurate. He rinsed a cup, felt the cold water numb his fingers to the second knuckle, and thought, without saying it, that an hour can remain precise in memory, even as years pass. Later, others would try to set the moment down on paper that endures, and the question would become not merely what had been felt, but what could be shown to have happened on a night when the enemy played music and the room decided to listen.
Morning hardened into years, and the hour asked to be proved. In a reading room where winter lodged itself in stone, a researcher unrolled the trail that men had left behind them and began to test memory against paper. The work did not announce itself with revelations. It began with cardboard boxes whose corners were polished by generations of hands, with index cards written in a strict hand that dragged a little on the downstrokes, with a pencil that left graphite on the fingers and a faint cedar smell that softened the sterile chill at the table. The pages came one after another, the way light comes through high windows in such places, angled, patient, indifferent to appetite. A diary opened to a night where the hand steadied in the middle of a line and then resumed as if a breath had been taken. The entry listed no names and made no claims about politics, only the arrangement of benches and the quiet that followed a certain cadence. The paper rasped under the weight of a palm that did not want to bruise it. Across the aisle, a microfilm machine hummed with the sound of a low motor agreeing to work. Black letters flickered on the screen and made the eyes hurt in a way that felt productive. In a different folder, a letter home mentioned a program without calling it extraordinary, as if the safest way to protect something tender was to hand it to the day's ordinary language and let it hide there. The lamp above the desk threw a circle of warmth that stopped short of the elbows. Beyond that line, the table remained cool and slightly gritty with the dust of older paper. The next layer belonged to inspection reports, written by men trained to count blankets and weigh rations and note with tidy caution the presence of cultural activities when they found them. A paragraph set among rations and medical supplies recorded that music had been permitted under supervision, that screens had been hung to dignify space, that instruments had been acquired or borrowed in ways not always clear to the bureaucracy, but acceptable to it. The prose was dry enough to resist sentiment, which made it especially persuasive. It mentioned permissions, hours, the language of order that had escorted the prisoners to their seats and seen them back again. It did not name Beethoven. It rarely named any composer at all, as if the point was not to adjudicate taste, but to ensure that time had been used within rules. The reading room smelled faintly of old glue and wool coats drying slowly near a radiator. Every so often, the window admitted a fresh seam of cold that stung the skin along the ridge of the nose and brought the research to attention. A pencil underlined a date and then hesitated beside a phrase that could mean either a rehearsal by prisoners or a performance by guards. The confusion did not reduce the weight of what the reports had witnessed. It only required the hand to write "perhaps" in the margin where certainty could not be earned. Memoirs did what memory always does. They drew rooms and faces with the precision of feeling, and then blurred the calendar until the line between seasons became subjective. One man placed the concert at a point in winter when breath turned immediately to frost. Another remembered a fly lifting from a window frame as if cheated of sleep by the scrape of a chair. The versions did not cancel each other. They agreed on the essentials, that there had been an hour in which music organized the room into something like consent, that tears appeared on faces unused to letting themselves be read, that applause had been cautious and real. The hands that wrote these books had old tendons and new aches. The paper smelled of modern ink and glue, and the jackets cracked softly when opened flat. A finger traced a sentence and then withdrew, leaving no trace but a remembering warmth. When the page turned, a small breeze lifted a ribbon of dust that showed itself in the sunbeam and then settled harmlessly away from the text.
The effort to fix a likely date became its own instrument, tuned carefully and played without flourish. Compound logs listed head counts and evening assemblies in a script that made 7 look like a soldier at parade rest. Weather notes in a different file named a stretch of nights cold enough to explain the sting men had described. A parcel register marked deliveries of strings and reeds, as if sending proof to an audience not yet born. The reading room's clock gave its gentle tick without hurrying anyone, and occasionally the silence was redrawn by the soft slide of a box being returned to its place on the shelf. If the program sheet existed in duplicate somewhere, it did not present itself on demand. The work accepted that it might never do so. What it had instead were converging lines strong enough to carry the shape of the thing. Inspection notes admitting cultural evenings under guard. Diaries that remembered benches and a precise quiet. A letter that mentioned a melody recognized by men who had been taught to distrust their own softness. An alternate explanation held its ground in the corner of the table, that a prisoner orchestra had been responsible for at least some of the music heard in that camp and on that night, and that the German role had been administrative rather than instrumental. This did not diminish the fact that men cried, nor did it abolish the strangeness of such feeling in a place organized to prevent it. The pencil made a small notation and then turned to sharpen against a square of folded paper, leaving a clean edge that made a good point. A leather-bound register released a slow sigh as it closed, and the thumb lifted from its spine felt the faint grease of decades. Outside the window, a bus hissed as it stopped at a light and then rolled on. The present insisted on being present, which was its right. The past waited without anxiety. It had grown patient by necessity. When the trail rejoined itself, it did so not with a single proof,
but with a bundle of witnesses whose agreement was more compelling than their minor disagreements could dislodge. A picture emerged of a night in the middle years of the war when permission arranged men in a room, and a score that predated all of them taught them for an hour how to sit together without collapsing into spectacle or discipline. The tidy hardware of administration could be seen under the fabric, the schedules and the posts, the seated rows and the watchful eyes. And over that frame lay the simple fact of music done correctly. Some faces in the records were named, and many were not. Some authorities signed in a hand that made their entire rank look like a flourish. Some prisoners wrote in pencil that faded where later readers pressed too hard. The air of the reading room grew warm around the lamp and cool at the edges. The hum of the machine subsided when the last roll was rewound and slid into its box. A page received one final line, narrow and deliberate. The memory holds, and the paper holds enough. The folder closed with a sound like a door set gently on its latch, and the file was returned to the stack with the practical care of someone who expects to open it again. Outside, the day thinned toward evening. Inside, the hour on the table reached forward without raising its voice, asking the next work to carry it into a fuller truth, where dates and names could be matched to what men felt when the enemy played music, and a room of prisoners decided, not for the last time, to listen.